Moed Katan Daf Yud Aleph contains one Mishnah and then concludes the first parak of the Masechta and begins the second parak with the Mishnah there. The end of the first parak is discussing a list of halachos of things you're allowed to do on Chol HaMoed and things you are not. So it's going to talk a little bit about things you're not allowed to do or are allowed to do for an Oved Avodah Zarah, which may cause him to thank his Avodah Zarah. The next parak will begin discussing the laws also of Chol HaMoed and when you're allowed to do things. It'll talk about permitted activities that you were forced to do then you couldn't have done earlier. The Gemara will get into the laws of Avelos, when a person is mourning, what he's allowed to do, what he's not allowed to do, which are similar halachas. So the Gemara first says that somebody is allowed to go to a fair held by the idol worshippers, and he's allowed to buy animals, slaves, servants, houses, fields, and vineyards, and he's allowed to then go to the non-Jewish court and write up contract. Now, the reason is, generally you're not allowed to go to a non-Jewish court. You have to only have things done in a Jewish court. Here, though, there is no way to get your purchase established, because they won't come with you to Beis Din, so you're allowed to go to their courts because you need to protect yourself from law, so you would be losing your property otherwise. Okay, more things which you are allowed or not allowed to do on Chol HaMoed, and verses Rav allowed Chia Bar Ashi to make nets to catch fish on Chol HaMoed. You're allowed to weave those nets, and the reason is because that's amateur things. It's not a professional activity, and therefore you're allowed to do it. However, to make bird nets, that requires professional skill, and therefore that's forbidden. And Yehuda said he allowed someone named Ami, the oven maker, he allowed him to make new ovens. He said it's okay to form the ovens. He allowed Rabba Bar Ashbi to make sieves as he wove together strands in order to make a sieve to sift out flour. Now, the Gemara asks, why did he allow him to make an oven? Don't we have a statement of Rabbi Bar Shmuel, who quotes a Brisa, who says you're not allowed to make an oven on Chol HaMoed? It's not a kasha, it depends what season it is. If you are on the rainy season, then you're not allowed to make an oven because it's not going to be ready in time for Chol HaMoed because it's very damp and wet. It'll take a long time for the clay to dry. If though you're in the dry season, then you are allowed to, because it'll dry right away, and you'll be able to make use of it on a Chol HaMoed, and therefore it's okay. Now, we begin our next Mishnah, the final Mishnah in the first parak. The Mishnah discusses fixing things, what repairs or construction you're allowed to do on a Chol HaMoed. So it says you're allowed to build a railing, a fence around the edge of a roof or of a porch, but you have to do it in a non-professional, in an amateurish kind of way, which the Gemara will explain. Now, you're allowed to fix an oven that has cracks in the walls or in the floor, so you can plaster over the cracks, and you can flatten the floor so that you'll be able to smooth out those cracks and fill them in. And what tool are you allowed to use to flatten the floor? So it says you're allowed to use a ma'agila, which is defined as a roller, or you're allowed to crush it with your hand or your foot to smash it down. You cannot use a tool called a machalatzayim, which is like a wooden foot, because that would be forbidden. That's more of a professional activity. Now, other repairs you're allowed to do, if you have a problem with the door, so if the hinge broke, or the hole that the hinge peg sits in broke, or the lintel, the threshold, if that broke, the top of the door frame, the lock broke, the key broke, all these things you're allowed to fix on Chol HaMoed, as long as you don't schedule it to happen on Chol HaMoed. You're allowed to fix them. And the reason you're allowed to is because there will be a loss. People will be able to get into your house and steal. You cannot plan it for this work, can't push off this work to happen on Chol HaMoed, but you're allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed if that's when it came out. Now, you're allowed to pickle food on Chol HaMoed to preserve it for long term. So Gemara says, yes, only if you could eat them already on Chol HaMoed. If you're going to pickle them in a way that they won't be able to be edible on Chol HaMoed, then you're not allowed to. But if you do pickle them now, and you'll still be able to eat them, and they're recently pickled state on Chol HaMoed, then you are allowed to do that. Okay, the Gemara begins. The Gemara wants to know when we said you can only install a fence around the roof or a porch in an amateurish kind of way. What does that refer to? What's an amateur way? So we have the same two opinions we saw earlier in that Masechta, either by weaving branches and leaves, or by piling stones and not cementing them together. As far as the oven, we said you can smear plaster over it, and you can flatten the floor with a roller. So the roller, we said you could do it with the roller tool, or by smashing it with your hand and your foot. So if you could use the roller, you can certainly use your hand and your foot. Why do you have to tell me you can use your hand and your foot? So the Gemara says that you can do them with your hand and foot in the way you would use a roller, meaning you should use your feet in order to smooth it and to crush it and flatten out the cracks like you would do with a roller. But you cannot go ahead and use a machlatzayim. That would be forbidden, like we saw in the Mishnah. Now, as far as the parts of the door that broke, so we saw you're allowed to fix that. So the Gemara says there's a problem, there's a contradiction between this Mishnah and a different Mishnah. This Mishnah indicates you're allowed to use tools. You're using the tools to fix the door, the lintel, the frame. You're also using some tools to fix the oven. You have a different Mishnah that says that you're not allowed to use tools. What's that referring to? So Mishnah says that when Rabbi Yochanan became Kohen HaGadol, and he became in charge, he told people they're not allowed to use hammers. Before him, you could hear the sound of hammers in Yerushalayim on Chol Hamoed because people were fixing things, but he said you're not allowed to. So you see that it's forbidden. He said that it's usher. So how here is our Mishnah say that you are allowed to. So the Gemara tries three answers. The Gemara's first answer is that it's different types of workers with different types of hammers. He ushered a blacksmith who's clanging on metal with a hammer that's very loud. But we're talking about carpenters, we're talking about fixing wood, and therefore it's not so loud, so you're allowed to. So the Gemara doesn't like this because then people will differentiate between loud noise and soft noise as to what's permitted and what's usher, and that's not what the halacha is. So the Gemara therefore says that a different answer might be that they're both working with wood, but one is working with a hammer, one's working with a saw. Saw doesn't make a loud sound at all, makes no sound that you could hear outside the house. It doesn't have a hacking sound to it. But the hammering, that's what they said is usher. Rav Papa gives a totally different explanation. He says that our Mishnah is talking about before Rabbi Yochanan made the rule. Once Rabbi Yochanan made the rule, you're not allowed to fix with tools. However, before he changed it, that's what our Mishnah is referring to. Now, the Gemara actually has a fourth answer, which says that it's a machlokes. That our Mishnah is Rav Yosi, and that Mishnah is Rav Yehuda. We have a machlokes between Rav Yosi and Rav Yehuda is to work which is permitted to do on a Chol Hamoed to prevent loss. Are you allowed to do it in the normal way, or do you have to do it in a changed way? So our Mishnah says you can do it in the normal way as Rav Yosi, and the other opinion that Rav Yehuda fits with Rav Yochanan Kohen Gadol's Mishnah, where it says you have to do it in a different way. You're not allowed to use tools which make loud sound. All right, now on to the topic of pickling things on Chol Hamoed. So the Gemara says that it once happened that the river, the Bedisa River, dried in a place called Levi. So the Babach here writes interestingly that the town of Bedisa was really just called Pum, and it was on the banks of the river Bedisa, which is why it was called Bedisa. Anyway, it's a different town on the river called Levi, and over there a stretch of river dried out, and there were lots of fish hanging around there for anybody to come and take. So a lot of people came and they gathered fish, but then they had to preserve it. So Rava said they're allowed to pack the fish in salt in order to preserve it. They should eat some of it. Obviously, the ones that they want for a yantif, they should eat for a yantif, and the rest they can pack in salt. Now, this all happened on Chol Hamoed. So Abaye asked, how are you letting them pack it in salt? Packing them in salt, they won't be able to eat it on Chol Hamoed. We said you're only allowed to pickle things which you're going to eat on Chol Hamoed, which are available to be eaten on Chol Hamoed. So Gemara says that Rava answered, there's two versions of this. Rava, according to the first version, answered, they brought it home intending to eat it, so it was permitted for them to bring it home. Once they have it at home, it's going to get ruined, it's going to spoil if they don't pack it in salt, and therefore it's a situation of preventing loss. Preventing loss is permitted, they're allowed to pack it in salt in order to save it. According to the second version, Rava actually told them to go out and catch the fish. He said it's mutter to go out and take the fish and to salt it. And the question was that you're not allowed to salt, you're not allowed to preserve things which you're not going to use on Chol Hamoed for afterwards. And the answer is, again, it was Abaye who asked it to Rava, and the answer is, like Shmuel said, that you can actually undo the salting and therefore be able to eat it with a process called itzitza. Machlokes Rishonim, if that means excessive washings or excessive squeezings. If you squeeze it, you squeeze out the salt. Gemara says that Shmuel had preserved salted fish, and they pressed it, or they squeezed it, or they rinsed it 60 times, and then he was able to eat it. Now, another story that happened with Rava was that he went to the house of Rish Lakish. They gave him a fish that they did itzitza to 60 times, and he ate it. Now, Rav went to the house of Rav Shapir. They gave him a fish which was 1/3 boiled, 1/3 salted, and 1/3 roasted. And that was, again, Rashi explains that the salted part was unsalted with this itzitza procedure. Now, once we discussed the eating of fish and how it's prepared, Rav says a few things in the name of Ada, the Tzayada, Ada the fisherman. He says, first of all, fish is at its best quality just before it spoils. It gets better as it gets old until it just spoils. Second thing is that the best way to eat fish is to boil it with its brother, to then put it in its father, eat it with its son, and drink its father. What does that mean? So he's referring to things that are all part of the water of the sea. So the fish to boil with his brother is referring to salt, which is sea salt. To place it in its father is that you should then put it in cold water. After you boil it, you should throw it into cold water. Eat it with its son means to put it in fish broth. That's the spiny, sharp liquid that seeps from the fish as it's being roasted. And then you drink it after you eat it, you should drink water. That's its father. Now, Rav also said that after eating fish, cress, or milk, you should do exercise. You should not go to sleep. It's unhealthy. And the last thing, and this is the end of the parak, is that after eating fish, cress, or milk, you should drink water but not beer. If you don't have any water, you could drink beer, but don't drink wine. Wine is the worst thing at that time. So now we begin the next parak, which discusses when you have work that is scheduled to be done, and if you cancel it, you're going to lose money. So the Mishnah says as follows: somebody who prepared his olives to be pressed. Olives, in order to be pressed, get the oil out, have to first be softened, so they're left to steep in a big vat, then they're turned over. From when they're turned over, they have to be pressed right away, or they'll spoil. They're going to rot, and they're going to be lost. So this person put his olives in to soften, then he turned them over, and he was about to press them. This was before Chol Hamoed. He wasn't planning on doing this in Chol Hamoed. Then something happened to prevent him from being able to do it, and the only time he could do it is now on Chol Hamoed. If that's the case, then he's allowed to go and do the pressing on Chol Hamoed to some extent, enough to prevent loss. So the Mishnah says, so if what happened was that he became an avel, became a mourner, and a mourner is not allowed to work, or some other incident prevented him, or he hired workers and the workers didn't show up, all these cases he legitimately needs to do the pressing on Chol Hamoed, so then he's allowed to do it. What is he allowed to do? So Rabbi Yehuda says he's only allowed to press once. He's allowed to put the heavy beam on the olives once to squeeze out the bulk of the oil. The rest of it he's not allowed to, either because it's not significant loss, whatever oil is left, or because it won't spoil once it's already been pressed the first time. Now Rabbi Yossi says he's allowed to do it. Normally he's allowed to do whatever he does. He's allowed to pour it onto the vat, put on the beam on top of it, the heavy weight, press it as many times as he wants. It's fine. Now the Gemara asks, he started off telling me that he couldn't press the olives because he became a mourner, became an avel. But then you're discussing whether or not he's allowed to do the work on Chol Hamoed. You didn't tell me if he's allowed to actually do the work when he's an avel. So why not? What is the halacha there? So Gemara has a machlokes. If Shisha Beit Ravidi says that's because then it's aser. You can see from the fact that the Mishnah didn't discuss doing it as an avel that it's forbidden. And Rav Ashi says no, it's permitted. And it's more permitted. It's obvious that it's permitted, and therefore the Mishnah doesn't discuss, and that's because the Isser to do malacha, to work when a person is a mourner, is an Isser d'Rabbanan. Here we're talking about the Isser to malacha on Chol Hamoed, which is an Isser d'Oraisa. So if the Isser d'Oraisa of Chol Hamoed is permitted in this situation of loss, then the Isser to do work as an Avel, which is only Rabbanan, is for sure permitted, and therefore it's mutter. Now the Gemara quotes a very lengthy brisa, the beginning of which supports Rav Shisha's position, or Rav Shisha Beit Davidi's position, that doing all this work on Chol Hamoed is aser. So the Gemara presents the lengthy brisa and explains it. So the brisa talks about the halachas of a mourner. When somebody becomes a mourner, what is he allowed to do? So it says if he has his olives already ready to go on the press and turned over, someone else should do the pressing for him. If he has a barrel of wine that needs to be sealed, otherwise he'll sustain a loss, someone else should do it for him. If he has flax that is soaking in a chemical that's used to prepare it, again, someone else should take it out for him. And if he has cloth that's sitting in a pot on the fire that is coloring it, has to be removed, somebody else should do it for him. So all these things should be done for him. And there you see that he shouldn't do it himself because it's forbidden for the Avel to do this work herself. Okay, now the brisa continues. Brisa says that someone else can water his field for him if it's in the proper time for watering. Rav Yehuda says if he has a field that was plowed to plant flax, he can even go ahead and have somebody plant it for him. And the reason is that flax, if it's not planted in the right time, you're going to lose the crop. It's got to be planted in the right time. Can't be planted later because it's going to be destroyed. If it's not planted right away, it'll have to be replowed. By the time you replow, it'll be too late. So Gemara says that's Rav Yehuda's opinion, but the Chachamim disagreed, and they said no, he could plant later. even though he'll have to replow it, let him replow it. It's not a loss, and then he'll plant the second crop. Or plant something else. Who says you have to plant flax? Just because you intend to plant flax here doesn't mean you have to plant something else which is able to be planted later. Now the Brisa continues. Shimon ben Gamliel says that all these things which we said somebody else should do for him, what's the halacha if there's no one else around to do for him? He's the only one who's able to do it. So then he can do it privately. He can do it. It has to be in a way that is not seen, because it would violate the Isser D'Rabbanan explicitly. Now, if he's a public servant and he needs to do things for the rabbim, such as if he's the barber or if he takes care of the bathhouse or things like that, and it's just before Yom Tov and they need those services, then he's allowed to do it even in public because the needs of the community allow him to do it even though he is in... Oh well. Now the Gemara talks about what happens if you're under contract to do work for someone, or someone's under contract to do work for you, and then somebody becomes a mourner, becomes an Ava. What do you do then? So first of all, we talk about a worker who is under contract to work in somebody's field. So there are three possible ways that deal can be set up: an aris, a chachir, or a kablon. An aris is someone who takes a percentage of the crop as his salary. A chachir gets a fixed amount as his salary, and a kablon is hired just to do the work, irrelevant of what happens. He works per day, and whatever he gets, that's for the time he does, that's the work he gets. Now, so these three are in contract to somebody else, and then they become a mourner, and now that person's going to lose. First of all, the worker's going to lose all his money, and then that person's going to lose his investment because he hired somebody to do it. It's not going to get done. So these people should get somebody else to do the work for them while they are a mourner. They can't do it themselves. They can get somebody else to do it for them. Now, somebody whose business is to rent out donkeys or camels or ships, they also cannot work, even if they're under agreement. If, however, they themselves are rented out and they hired them out to someone else, then they are allowed to work. If it's a long-term agreement, if it's a day-by-day agreement, then they can cancel it because they're not going to lose money for that, and the owner can hire somebody else. You're not under long-term obligation for him. Now, here the Mishnah says, even though you're being paid for the job as a whole and not for the time that you work. So Gemara says, if you're being paid for the job as a whole, you're for sure not going to lose. That should be obvious that you're not allowed to do the work yourself. So the Gemara says, yeah, so you have to change the text here a little. We just have to say whether he's being paid per job or paid per hour. Either way, he's still not allowed to work and he could get out of the deal. Now, somebody hired somebody else to work in his, so that person is working on his things. So he shouldn't work in the mourner's house. So if the mourner has a pre-existing deal with somebody to work for him, the work could be done in the worker's house or someplace else, not in the mourner's house, because then it looks like he hired him now, or it looks like he is involved in the work. Then there's an incident. The Gemara says that Merion, son of Ravin, and Man, son of Ravacha, son of Rava, they were partners in a yoke of oxen. That is, they had a pair of oxen. They each owned one and had a yoke, and they worked together. And Mar, Breder Ravacha, Breder Rava became a mourner. So he took his ox out of the work. The halach is midrabanan, and you're not allowed to have your animal work for you when you're a mourner. So Rav Ashi said, how could he do that? He's a great man. He should know that you can do that because you can't cause a loss to somebody else. Your work is not allowed to happen, but your animal is part of this team, which is working, and it's co-owned by someone else. So Gemara says, well, he felt that he was under Mechashev, and the rules, and under Mechashev has stricter rules. He has to make sure that there is no appearance or semblance of impropriety, and therefore he took his animal out.